what do we do? How do we get ourselves from this condition of reactivity and fear, restored into a condition of trust in our day-to-day, moment-to-moment, walking around lives? And so we started exploring this question: what is it that causes us to shift below the line in the first place? Oh, you're amazing. Thank you, Joe. Let's just go ahead and fill in the blanks. Oh, look at that. Are we all happy now? I can shift back above the line now. Okay. What is it for us to manage to understand, to shift back above the line? What is it that causes us to be below the line in the first place? And so we started exploring this question, this idea, this possibility. Isn't it when reality isn't what we'd wish it to be? Isn't that what causes us really to shift below the line in the first place, when reality isn't what we'd wish it to be? And over the past 2 weeks, Amber and Austin have done an amazing job of unpacking this for us. And we've explored, when people in our lives show up in a way that is different than how we'd wish them to be, is a major cause of us finding ourselves below the line. When people show up different than how we'd wish them to be. Or when our circumstances, when the events of our lives unfold, when the information that comes to us, or just what we thought would happen, when the events or circumstances of our lives are different than what we'd wish them to be. And we unpacked that too. But perhaps what shows up for some of us more frequently that is different than we'd wish it to be, perhaps, is this: when we aren't who we'd wish to be. When we show up in life different than who we would wish to be. When do you find yourself wishing you were different than you are? For me, it was just this morning. I didn't have a great illustration for this yet, but it didn't take long, and this morning one came to the surface. Our children had been away with Grandma and Grandpa for 4 days, which is a long time for anybody to have our children. Trust me. They'd been watching them for 4 days, and while they were watching them, I found out that I was going to be required to travel out of town in the coming week, so starting tomorrow. And Monica has to work tomorrow. And so we realized we're going to need someone to watch our kids on Monday of this week. And it was my responsibility to humbly reach out to Grandma and Grandpa and see if they'd be willing to watch them for a 5th day of the week. That was my responsibility. Otherwise, we have no one to watch our children. And I knew that was my responsibility. And I meant to reach out to them. And every day I woke up and it was on my list of things to do: call Grandma and Grandpa and ask them to watch the kids. And then this morning we're driving into church and Monica said, "So did you call Mom and Dad and ask them to watch the kids?" And I thought, no. And have you been in that moment where just like something inside of you just sinks and you're like, I hate that I didn't. I hate myself so much in this moment. I wish I weren't the person who always waits until the last minute. I wish I were organized. I wish I would think forward more. I wish I'd be more respectful of other people's time. And internally, you just go into this downward spiral of self-hatred and self-bullying and beating yourself up because you think that if I just beat myself up enough, then I won't be like this anymore. When do you find yourself wishing you were different than you are? I wish I didn't have this anxiety constantly. I wish I could just be happy the way that everybody else is happy. I wish that what they do so easily were as easy for me. I wish I weren't getting older. I wish I weren't so young. I wish I hadn't made those choices back then. I wish I had saved more when I was younger. I wish I were more disciplined. I wish I had what they had. I wish I'd made the choices that they had made. I wish that I were different than I am. And we know why we do this. We know this. We all know this. The reason we do this is because we are wired for connection. We're wired for connection. Our brains interpret physical pain the same way they interpret rejection. That if you looked at an MRI, a brain scan of a brain experiencing physical pain and a brain experiencing social relational rejection, they would look identical. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart, which means that your brain interprets rejection the same way it does physical pain, because we are wired for connection. We're wired for acceptance. And this is what the scriptural narrative so beautifully portrays, that they were both naked and they felt no shame. There were no barriers between them. There were no pretenses between them. And they were fully and completely accepted and welcomed. But we don't have that anymore. On the other side of Eden, we don't have that. And so what our brains do is they scan our environment for any indication or possibility of rejection. Now, here's what your brain does. You might not know that it does this, but it does this. All of our brains do this. Your brain has a strategy, a default strategy for protecting you from rejection. That inside your brain, you have some kind of standard that has developed over your life. A standard for, if I can be this, I will be safe from rejection. All kinds of things and experiences and people and voices and messages have informed what your standard is. Your standard comes from... Wasn't that terrific? It's been reinforced by others. That you have some kind of standard that you think, if I can just be this, I'll be acceptable. It's been formed by what your parents told you. It's been formed by the messages you received in middle school. It's been informed by the culture that you find yourself immersed in. It's informed by what you see your neighbors doing. It's informed by what you see rewarded and praised on Facebook. It's rewarded and informed by what others have reinforced. It's formed by what we've imposed on others. Oh, if you have children, you know this because you've done this. Before you had kids, you knew how to be the perfect parent, right? And you judged other parents. You, the not yet parent, judged other parents for how they parented and said, I would never parent like that. And then you had kids. And you parented just like that. And you found that the standard that you had created for others, that you fell so far below it. Oh, and you hated yourself for it, the standards that we impose on others. And it causes us to reread Jesus' words a little bit differently. The standards that you use against others will be used against you. Who is the one imposing those standards? The standards that we've imposed on ourselves, the things that we feel like we have to be, that we have to keep our home neat, that we have to have kids who behave a certain way, that we have to make a certain level of income, the standards that we create for ourselves that we feel like we need to live up to. And not least importantly, the religious and spiritual standards, the messages that we've received, that this is what allows your spiritual community to accept you and to approve of you. This is what allows God to receive and accept and approve of you. All of these things go into informing this standard. And this standard might change from context to context to context. But we all have some kind of standard. We think, if I can just live up to this standard, I'll be okay. And more often than not, we find ourselves below this standard, living for acceptance. Living our lives for acceptance, to live up to what we believe would allow us to be accepted and safe. We find ourselves beneath it, and the unconscious belief that we have is, as long as I'm below the standard, I'm not okay. I'm not okay just the way that I am. And here's how this comes up. Here's where we can notice this in our lives in all kinds of different ways. When we give ourselves these kinds of messages, when we say things like, I know God forgives me, but I just can't forgive myself. I'm not okay, just as I am. Or I'm better than that. How many times have you looked back on a decision or an action or behavior and said, I'm better than that, and you won't let yourself off the hook about it. You're not okay, just as you are. Or I'm such a, or I always, or I never, right? Those inflammatory remarks that I'm such a procrastinator, I'm such a lazy person, or I always fail to do this, or I never do that, or I shouldn't, our should statements. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be thinking this. I shouldn't be feeling this, or I should be past this now. I should be over this now. I should be more mature than this now. Or I hate that I hate that I'm always late. I hate that I'm always running behind. I regret that I wish I'd never. I wish I would have. I wish I could just go back, or I wish that I would. We find ourselves, these thoughts are indications we have shifted into a place of fear. And in this case, when it's fear of who we are or what our actions or behaviors are indicating about us, it's a specific fear we call shame. We spend so much time and give so much attention to the shame in our lives. And from this place of shame, we end up building fear-driven, shame-based strategies for change, right? Constantly criticizing, bullying, beating ourselves up, poking and prodding ourselves. If anybody talked to our kids the way that we talk to ourselves, or from these fear-driven, shame-based strategies, we tend to ignore the things that seem to contradict this standard. We justify them, we deflect them, we blame it on others. We say, if they hadn't, or if things weren't, I never would have. And so we never really look at the things that are inside of us with open eyes and complete honesty. We just kind of push them aside, we neglect them, or we take these parts of ourselves that are just broken, hurting, or need healing, and we exile them and just put them aside. And I can reach this standard if I just weren't this, and I hate this, I'm going to hate it enough that it just dies. But that thing that you want to die is a thing that's a part of you. And best case scenario, from these fear-driven, shame-based strategies, best case scenario, you get here. Congratulations. Now you've done the things that have made you righteous. And now you are self-righteous. And now we use this standard to judge everybody else. And our character hasn't grown at all. Best case. So what do we do? What do we do when you are other than you would choose. And so we find this terrific engagement, this terrific encounter, this conversation between Jesus and one of his disciples. And it's recounted to us by a man named John. John, who was an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. He was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, spent 3 years walking with Jesus, learning from Jesus, eating with Jesus. And at the end of Jesus' life, John wrote an account of the life of his friend Jesus. And the way that John starts the account out, it's just terrific and fascinating and beautiful. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was God, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of truth and grace. John's saying, we've seen in the person of Jesus what God is like, and he's full of grace. And fast forward to the end of the story, in the final days of Jesus' life, as John recounts them, in the final hours of Jesus' life, John shines the spotlight on one relationship that leads to one encounter, as if to underscore and highlight, and this is what grace looks like. You've been in church, if you've been around church, you've probably heard this story before. Jesus is sitting with his disciples the night before he would go to the cross. So the 12 of them are there, and among them, Peter. And if you've read the Gospels, you've been in and around church, you know Peter is always the loudmouth, always the brash one, always the one who has to prove himself. And Jesus looks at his disciples and essentially says, I'm telling you, I'm going to be arrested, put on trial, handed over, and crucified, and all of you are going to abandon me. Shocked. And Peter raised his hand and said, no, 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 not me. I would never do that. Everybody else may run away and abandon you, Jesus, but not me. I am this kind of guy, and you can count on me. And Jesus said, listen, I know that's who you think you are, but there's more beneath the surface than you're aware of. Even you are going to abandon me. And Peter said, even if I have to die with you. Jesus said, okay. So that night, Jesus was arrested. He was taken and put on trial. And they're in this courtyard, and they're questioning Jesus, and they have Jesus bound, and they're striking him. And the disciples have followed at a distance, and they're watching from outside the courtyard. And there's a girl kind of standing outside the courtyard who's also watching this go on, a young girl. And she looks at Peter and the other disciples who are with him, and she says, aren't you one of his followers? Peter says, not me. And she asks him again and again, and he denies Jesus again and again. And in one of the other accounts from one of the other disciples, they talk about how at that moment Jesus made eye contact with Peter, and Peter realizes that what Jesus had predicted would happen had happened, that he had denied Jesus outright in his greatest moment of need. Imagine his heart thinks. Peter, who always saw himself as this, walks off into the dark, just broken over who he is and what this means. And we fast forward through John's narrative from Jesus' arrest to his trial, to his crucifixion, to be put in the tomb, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, just like he said he would. And he comes back and he meets with his disciples. They're out fishing, and Jesus calls them in from the boat, and Peter just jumps over the side, starts swimming ashore, always so brash, always has to be the first one in line. They're sitting on the shore, they have breakfast with Jesus, and after breakfast, Jesus pulls Peter aside because there's still this knot in Peter's stomach over what he'd done, that things weren't quite reconciled. And here's what Jesus says to Peter. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, you love me more than these? And Peter, who's just so incredulous, is like, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Like, why would you even ask me? Why does this even have to be a thing? You know how we get so defensive when we're in this place of being below who we think we should be? It's just like, why would you even need to ask me this? I mean, you know that I love you. And Jesus just calmly says, well, feed my lambs. Feed my lambs then. And Peter's thinking like, what? Like, feed your lambs? What are you even talking about? And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He's like, yes. Why is this a thing? Why are we even having this conversation? He said, well, take care of my sheep. He's like, what? Why do you keep saying that kind of stuff? And one more time, a third time, Jesus said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him this third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Why do you keep asking me? And maybe the reason Jesus kept asking, maybe the reason he asked him the third time, we don't know. It doesn't explain it. Pastors have all kinds of guesses. We truly don't know. But maybe Jesus asked him a third time because, well, Jesus knew that Peter loved him. Jesus wanted Peter to know that he loved him. That perhaps Jesus was wanting to drive home. Peter, I know you denied me. I know that that is so different than who you thought you were. But you still love me. Yeah. I know you've been hurt by the church. You've had to put some distance between you and God, but you still love him. I know that the scripture has been used to manipulate and control you, and you've had to separate and distance yourself from it, but you still love Jesus. I know that life has been hurtful and it's been disappointing, and you've had to develop some strategies just to get through it, but you still love him. It's still there. He's like, I know this. I want you to know this. And then a third time, feed my sheep. Oh, Peter, I want you to see that you might not be who you thought you were, but you still have a place with me. You are still welcome and accepted here. Here, I want you to know that you still love me. Yeah, this is how, I get it. I get it. You never thought that you would do that. I get it. But you still love me, and I love you still. And I still have a place for you here. This is John, the storyteller, saying, remember where we started this story? God full of grace. This is what it looks like. Jesus standing in front of you. You have a place with me still. Look. Peter, you thought you were this kind of person. You thought you had to be this kind of person. You held yourself to this standard. But guess what? I knew all along that you were really like this kind of person. And the only thing that's changed is now you know that you are this kind of person. And there's nothing wrong with being this kind of person, because here's the reality, Peter. This doesn't matter. I am the standard bearer, and I will move my standard to meet you where you are. And what covers the difference between where you think you should be and where you actually are, what covers that distance is grace. My grace is inviting you from fear-driven, shame-based living for acceptance to living from a place of acceptance. And another first century follower of Jesus would drive this point home. A man named Paul, who, if denying Jesus wasn't bad enough, Paul went ahead and started persecuting followers of Jesus, overseeing their martyrdom and putting them in prison. And it was on his way to put followers of Jesus in prison that he encountered the resurrected Jesus. And then Jesus, similar to Peter, instead of saying, "How could you? Who do you think you? Why would you ever?" Jesus invites Paul to become his follower. I have a place for you. Still, you are still accepted here. And Paul becomes a follower of Jesus and is instrumental in the spread of the Jesus movement throughout the Roman Empire. And Paul, who would face all kinds of persecution, would face struggles within himself, struggles from outside of himself. In one of his letters where he's talking about one of his struggles, he's talking about it vaguely. We don't know what the struggle is. He refers to it as a thorn in his side. And he describes that Jesus appeared to him, which seems to happen every time we find ourselves in this place where we don't quite measure up to the standard. Just like Jesus pulled Peter aside, Jesus pulls Paul aside, and he says, "My grace is sufficient for you. I have enough grace to cover the difference no matter where you are. My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness." Power of God is grace, and grace finds its fullest release in making up the difference between where we think we should be and where we find ourselves actually. And Jesus says, "I will show up in front of you to remind you that my grace is sufficient, that you have a place with me still. I will show up and show up and show up and remind you of this over and over until my grace gets inside of you and you stop believing in my grace as something about me, but believe in it as something about you." And when grace gets inside of us, when it stops being something that we believe about God and something that we believe about ourselves, grace transforms us. And this is what Peter experienced. Peter, who the night before had been denying Jesus to an adolescent girl, goes from coward to stepping out into the streets of Jerusalem and looking in the faces of the leaders who just crucified Jesus, and instead proclaiming Jesus and putting his life on the line over and over and over again because he was transformed by the grace of Jesus. Paul would describe a similar dynamic. Paul described it this way. Oh, I got out of order. Let's come back to that. Let's go ahead one, and then we'll come back to this. Paul would describe one forward. Go backwards. Maybe it didn't get in there. All right. Hold on right there. Paul would say, and you may remember this, he would say, "For I am what I am. By God's grace, I am what I am." Because of the grace of God, I can look at myself and where I am with eyes wide open, and I am what I am. I am the least, he says, of all disciples, but I have worked harder than all of them. Paul's saying, look, I can be honest with myself. I'm the worst, and I'm okay with that. Because of the grace of God, I am what I am, and I can be okay with that. But I've worked harder than everybody else. And he goes on to say, but not me. It hasn't been me, but the grace of God within me. When the grace of God became internalized, that became the thing that produced transformation. And then Paul in another place would describe it this way. Now we can go forward. Oh, there it is. Hey, look at us. I know it was in there somewhere. All right. Let's go to Ephesians. Thank you. You're amazing. Paul would say it, he would describe it this way. For it is by grace you've been saved through trust. Or you may have heard that translated faith. By grace we're saved through faith. Faith is translated in the same Greek word, pistis, that also means trust or confidence in God, that it's by grace. It's by grace we are saved. And that word saved is describing transformation into Christ-likeness. It's by grace that we're transformed into the image of God through trust. It's grace that restores trust. It's when we understand that by grace, God's standard for us has come down to meet us where we are. And when we find ourselves accepted by God, not living for acceptance, but living from acceptance, we trust Him. Of course you do. You don't trust someone who doesn't accept you. You don't trust someone who says, oh, for me to be okay with you, you have to live up to this standard. We trust someone who says, just as you are welcome here. Grace produces trust. And from that trust, image of God within you grows. Grace cultivates the soil, the internal condition of trust that produces, that brings to fullness the image of God that is in you. When grace is internalized, when God's grace is internalized within us, the image of God becomes actualized. When we get God's grace inside of us, what allows the image of God within us to come to fullness. Grace is the remedy. Grace is what God in the person of Jesus came to show us about Himself. Grace is the healing remedy that restores us to experience and engage in life the way that we were created to, the way that we were meant to look and love just like Jesus. It's grace that allows us to look at ourselves with eyes wide open, with complete honesty. It's grace that allows us to welcome in the parts of ourselves that have been exiled, that are hurting, that need healing, that need attention. The parts of ourselves that have unmet needs that need to be cared for and tended to and restored into maturity. It's grace that allows us to dig into ourselves and welcome all of ourselves into the healing of God's grace. When it gets inside of us, it's the remedy. And just like any remedy, it does you no good to have the remedy in your medicine cabinet. It does you no good to put the remedy out on the counter so you remember to take it in the morning. It does no good to believe that the remedy is effective. The only way the remedy actually produces anything for you is when it gets inside of you. It has to be internalized. It does us no good to believe in the grace of God. We have to internalize the grace of God. And the way that we internalize the grace of God is when we go from saying, I know that God accepts me, to saying, and I accept me too. When we receive God's grace as permission to accept ourselves, self-acceptance, your acceptance, your wide-eyed acceptance of you, just as you are, because you've received permission from God to do this, is how you internalize grace. The only path, the restoration that God is inviting us into. And we're terrified of this, aren't we? We're terrified of this. And you hear this in church world. The murmurings of grace is good, but let's not get carried away with it. Grace is good, but let's not take this as license to sin. Grace is good, but let's not make it too available. And I think Jesus is sitting back thinking, are you crazy? This is the remedy. This is the fix. Drink the whole bottle. Don't dilute it. Drink the whole bottle all the time. This is what helps. But we're afraid because we think if we let off the gas of fear and shame, then we won't change. We think the only way to change is to keep prodding ourselves with fear and shame. Fear and shame. Where has that gotten us? Gotten us living for, or maybe even at best, self-righteousness. But it hasn't brought restoration because it doesn't. Jesus says, you know what does? Grace. 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 Because only when we accept ourselves as we are can we become who we want to be. Like using Waze. I love Waze. It lets me know where all the cops are, right? Primarily. And when I enter directions into Waze, it always needs to know where I am before it can give me directions. Why? How do you get directions if you don't know where you are, right? Create any directions. It's all arbitrary until you know where you are. Waze doesn't work until it knows where you are. Can't guess at where you are. The directions won't be helpful. It has to know where you are. We can't get to where we want to go until we are open and honest about where we are. Grace doesn't mean that we never change. Doesn't mean that we excuse everything that we do. Doesn't mean that we turn a blind eye to the things that cause hurt to other people. It just means we're very open and honest about these things. And we say, wow, that was in me. Okay, let's take a look at that and see where that's coming from. Because I can't get to where I need to go until I know where I am. And the only way I can adequately understand where I am by, with open honesty, accept this where I am. And this is who I am. And this is who I've become. Like it or not, most often we don't like it, but the truth is, you can't change who you are. And by that I mean, you can't change who you've become in this right now moment. In this right now moment, you are the culmination of the choices you've made, the habits you've created, the things that have been done for you, the things that have been done to you, and none of those things you go back and change. That who you are in this right now moment, you can't change that. But when we accept who we are in this right now moment, and we can look at it with open honesty and curiosity, well, then we can change who we become. And this is what Jesus is inviting us into. And the remedy is grace, because only when we accept ourselves as we are can we become who we want to be. Now, how do we begin to do this? A simple practice. And if you've been following along and you've been doing this, great. You can just add this in. But if you don't, you might have to go back to the step of cultivating self-awareness. And again, self-awareness is at any point in time, can I check in with myself and see, am I above or below the line? At any point in time. And at those points, if we find ourselves below the line, check in with ourselves and ask, is there something right now that I need to accept about myself? What is it in this moment right now that I just need, with openness and honesty, to accept is true about me? And then, and this takes time, begin practicing it. It's a little clunky when you start practicing it, but the more you do this, the more it just becomes a habit. And it's just what you do. What is it in me that I'm rejecting? What needs to be accepted in me in this moment? And then to visualize sitting across the table from Jesus, who's just so happy to have you in his presence, who's so happy to be at table fellowship with you, and to take that thing and just to put it on the table between you and Jesus, and to experience his response to that thing. To experience Jesus looking at that. And just like with Peter, saying, I know. I knew that was there this whole time. This is not a surprise to me. And I love you still. We're okay with that thing. You can work on that thing. It's a part of you. You can work on this. You still have a place here. You're still accepted here. And with his permission, you can accept that as a part of you. And when that becomes an accepted part of you, it becomes something that you can give attention to, that you can cultivate, that you can nurture, that you can give what it needs. But it starts with just building a basic habit of just through our days, just being able to check in with ourselves and just say, above or below the line right now. Okay, I'm feeling a little bit reactive right now. I'm a little bit below the line. What is it in me that needs to be accepted right now? Can I allow myself to experience God's acceptance? I receive permission to accept that that is true about me. That's it. That's it. It can be a visualization that you do throughout your day. It can be a visualization that you spend time doing in the morning. You can set your morning meditation, quiet prayer time up to be a visualization where you think of, in my previous day, where was I below the line? What do I need to go back and accept is true about me? Next month, we're going to start talking about what do we do with that? So we've become self-aware. We're identifying the things that we need to accept. And once we become honest with ourselves, what do we do next? What do we do with that? But it starts here, like we said, accepting ourselves as we are. Receiving God's grace as permission to accept ourselves as we are is how we internalize God's grace. And only then can we become who we want to be. Is the transforming remedy of God and Christ get inside of us. And we become, you were always meant to be. You are the light of the world. And what allows that light to shine, grace of God gets inside of. Would you guys pray with me? God, we are so grateful for you. In this moment, with all of our past choices already made, the events that have unfolded in our lives already done, the habits that we've built already here, in this moment, give us the freedom and the safety to lay that on the table in front of you. and to feel the warmth of your smile, the warmth of your approval, the warmth of knowing that none of this is a surprise to you. You're just so glad to have us here. Allow us to feel your grace. Allow it to get inside of us. Do the work of transformation that only your grace. We ask it in Jesus' name.